Okay, so our next speaker is Chris Manchur from the Canola Council of Canada, talking about some canola emergence and establishment issues. Chris joined the Canola Council in May of 2022 as an agronomy specialist for the Eastern Manitoba region and as the sclerotinia and research lead for the crop production and innovation team. He received his master's degree researching next-generation RNAi fungicides and his Bachelor of Science in Plant Biotechnology at the U of M. Chris is currently involved in managing the Canola Council's Agronomic Research Program and the 2022 to 28 Sustainable Agriculture Partnership Canola Agri-Science Cluster. So thank you, Chris, for being here.
Hello again. Here I am for my second presentation, and once again, I am the only thing between you guys and another break, but don't worry, even though this presentation is a little bit longer than my last one, it'll go by pretty quickly. So, as the title behind me says, I am going to be talking a little bit about some of the challenges that we experienced this year in Manitoba, talking about canola emergence and establishment. And of that, there were definitely a few. And within the Canola Council, we actually took a step back and took a look at what were our top yield robbers for Manitoba and also across the prairies. And what we found was that two of those top yield robbers happened pretty early in the season. We're talking about excess moisture, and we're also talking about flea beetles. And so I'm going to be talking a little bit about that, a little bit about fertility, a little bit about setting your target plant stand, and then kind of wrapping things all up with a few graphs kind of tied in together to show where we were at and what kind of environmental conditions really set us up for the rest of the season. But I didn't get a whole lot of time to just talk a little bit about myself. I know we had a great introduction. Thank you, Anne, for that. But just highlighting that I just joined the Canola Council at the beginning of this growing season, and what a growing season it was to actually join them. And I'm kind of responsible for a decent chunk of the Manitoba territory here, along with Courtney Boychuk and also Warren Ward up in the northwest corner here. So a lot of these challenges that we've seen here regarding excess moisture and such, and these big lakes that we saw all of a sudden pop up in Manitoba, were kind of in the area that I got to take a tour around. But let's take a little bit of a step back and take a look at kind of where we ended up in 2021. Now, we all know 2021 was quite a drought year. We had fairly low yields because of that. You know, we were averaging around that 30 bushels per acre or so. But we did see that there was a return to soil moisture coming in that fall. And so actually, throughout the fall, and you know, we're going into the rest of the winter, that all that moisture kind of came back, right? And what we really need to look at is what does this mean for, say, our fertility and our seeding plans for the next year, and namely on nitrogen. And so we did see a few media conversations and all that, especially from John Hurd, who did a great job on actually explaining the situation in terms of nitrogen and potential losses. But I'll talk about that a little bit later. Winter and early spring, we kind of went from very nice, adequate soil moisture, and then all of a sudden we saw a huge increase in the amount of average precipitation, reaching over 200% actually in the Red River Valley. And this is only in the 90 days leading up to May 2nd, and we all know that throughout May and even into June and maybe slightly in a bit of July, we also saw some pretty big downpours across Manitoba as well. And so while that big blue part right there isn't actually a lake. I mean, I did take a look at this satellite image, which was, I believe, in May 5th. Yeah, May 5th, so just a few days after that last map was put together. But we can really highlight and see the extent of that flooding that we saw in Manitoba. And I'll just highlight a little bit there. We can actually see Winnipeg up in the top right corner, and then we see that little island of Morris just completely surrounded by water through there. And I know that in some of those fields there that they actually were underwater for quite a while and really kind of delayed things back. So while this definitely doesn't represent all of Manitoba, definitely mainly in the Red River Valley, it's a pretty good representation that whether it's underwater or highly stressed conditions and high soil moisture, that's going to really go and dictate how the rest of that seeding season is going to go. And yeah, so this really sets the stage for 2022. And, you know, when we're looking at some situations that happened so early in our growing season, that kind of has a knock-on effect for every kind of other decisions that are made later on, whether that's talking about delayed seeding, referring to, say, yield potential, whether some growers had to modify their cropping plans where they couldn't get into a certain field when they had planned to, had this planned rotation, then they have to go to another one. Fertility plans may have changed, whether you can't use super heavy equipment or apply a lot of fertility earlier on. Plenty of available moisture, yeah, that's good in some cases. Altered seeding plans, you know, we even saw a few cases, I think, actually, where some canola seed was floated by plane. Taking a look at it, actually didn't look too bad, actually, but it's definitely not something that you can do every year, right? And then if you were to summarize that all to, you know, once that canola actually pops out of the ground, it is likely to become stressed. And when it becomes stressed, it's now working as an uphill battle towards all the other challenges that are coming through, you know, if it's flea beetles or if we're talking about later stage diseases, all those things add together into what we see later on as the resultant yield. So talking about yield, this is some MASC data from 2010 to 2019, and I highlight in a red box, not the simplest to see there, but in that green line, we're looking at the yield of canola, that's the gray line, the yield of canola depending on the week of seeding. And so, say the first week of May, which is at the very beginning of this graph, we're looking at, you know, just above average fields. If you can get that crop in, it actually gets out of the ground. But as we follow along, you know, we're getting into late May, fairly normal, you know, we're at around that 90% of potential yield. And then when we start going into June, to that third week of June, we're actually reaching about that 80% of that potential yield that we see. So when you're looking at, say, the Canola Council's target of 52 bushels an acre, and you're taking a 20% knockoff of that, that brings us down to, you know, 40, 42 bushels, which is what we've experienced here, and I think the average yields were happening around that in Manitoba. So really, when we're looking at all that excess moisture and what it translates into the potential yield, I'd say that's a fairly major culprit, is just that little bit of a lack of a growing season. Here's another graph that I took a look at from, I believe it's the National Agriculture Information Service. And so this satellite forecasting map was made as of July 4th. And really, for the most part of Manitoba, we actually see, you know, fairly decent yield predictions, about that 40 bushels an acre or so. And maybe that's something that was reached or probably definitely surpassed in a lot of cases. But what I really want to focus on is some of those other situations. You know, we're taking a look at, say, the Interlake up north near the Arborg area, or we're taking a look at, say, in the Parkland, where a lot of acres were unfortunately unseeded due to all that excess moisture. Those crops have a much more difficult time of recovering. And while we do see, say, in the Red River Valley and a lot of the southern Manitoba, that yield potential was probably higher than those as of July 4th, we know that things like, say, Justine mentioned on verticillium and other conditions definitely probably had yield impact and lowered that. So switching gears back to fertility. Some of the predictions that we saw in 2021 is that through that we had a fairly drought year, that there was probably a lot of soil residual nitrogen. And what would that mean for our 2022 growing season? So we think that usually if you have a little bit more nitrogen coming in the fall, you can apply less a little bit later for the spring season. But unfortunately, that wasn't really the case because of all that excess moisture. The denitrification and the leaching from all that, you know, microbial activity, looking at some work there, looks like we had about a 20 to 40 pounds per acre reduction in residual N because of that. And so if you don't have that nitrogen available for that crop, you know, earlier on, that's definitely going to have that little bit of an impact too. Yeah, so I zoomed in a little bit there just to see that nice cycle that we have, and then a little bit of a plug again back to the 4 Rs, right? So just expanding upon this a little bit further, and so this graph was taken from the Manitoba Crop Pest Update in May 25th, so this is after all that spring seeding. And in all 6 of those sites, we see that between the fall sampling and the spring sampling, we saw a migration of this nitrogen going deeper into the soil, and also a reduction of that too. So pretty much really what you want to summarize from that is that soil testing is super important in the fall, and then also knowing what kind of expectations of nitrogen you'll have ready for that canola come in the spring. And so while, yeah, conditions may have been favorable then, definitely have to keep in mind what happens later on. This was a little bit of a graph that I took from some weather data coming out of Winkler, Manitoba. And so we saw, we had some precipitation events earlier on, and then we had this big spike at the end of May, actually, where we saw, 30, 50, 55, 60 millimeters of rain within the past, few days. And so while this doesn't maybe relate exactly to, say, seeding, because, a lot of the people were able to get their seed in the ground just before that, what may happen after that, and especially with the clay-textured soils there, is soil crusting, and you get all that stranded seed there. And this was another challenge that we experienced in some fields there. And really what happens from that is that all of a sudden that soil dries out, potentially dried out a little bit quicker, especially when we wanted to go and cultivate those soils and dry them out. That may have had a more of a negative impact with compaction. And then that resulted in a poor Z-bed, and now we see these canola seeds that just aren't doing really much of anything. So, soil crusting, what is our options? We could harrow. That is a very risky proposition to actually make, because if you do have some canola that could be growing there, you're just going to be ripping out those roots, drying them out. And so it's not something really we advise. But really what we want to do here is essentially look like Andy Dufresne from the Shawshank Redemption and just pray for that rain. So we want rain to actually resolve that soil crusting issues. That will actually loosen up that soil and allow that canola to actually pop through, especially in those clay soils that you can't push through at all. So another thing that could be done is just wait a little bit. When we're looking at, say, talking about plant stands, even a plant stand of 2 plants per square foot could be viable. And this should come with a bit of an asterisk, because you have to also take into account any further challenges down the line, right? But compare that to, say, purchasing more seeds, seeding again, putting more equipment onto that field. There must be some sort of cost-benefit analysis that you guys will have to take into account too. And of course, then that leads off into reseeding. So if you see that if you wait a few days, nothing's popping out, it's really not improving, then you'll probably have to come back and do it over again. So the next thing, and talking about, and I think we've had quite a few discussions at the Canola Council and working with agronomists everywhere across Manitoba, was that flea beetles seem to have quite an impact this year, and we saw a lot of growers actually go and apply, upwards of 5 insecticide applications, foliar applications for this, and just to kind of keep that canola alive, because canola can have a little bit of a struggle earlier on, especially at these susceptible seedling stages. So we do have this life cycle of the flea beetle here, and we see that that greatest amount of damage that may happen in that early May all the way to mid-June or so is usually where we want to be most concerned about. But this really wasn't the case, because, well, first off, there was barely any seeding being actually done in early May, but later on, if everything shifts, so does that feeding period also happen too. So we saw a lot of flea beetle feeding later on that kind of staggered and moved along with the canola emergence, so it just kind of followed that. And so we think, when we're talking about, delaying seeding for flea beetles, having to keep in mind, the rest of the growing season, that it may be just relative. We do have this Canola Council infographic that's looking at 25% as the action threshold, and we actually need to apply foliar insecticide treatments or engage in management practices for that. And sometimes this can actually be reached fairly quickly. 25% defoliation by a flea beetle, could happen within a day or two, or, even within a few hours if it's very, very serious. So, while this infographic is very good, we also kind of have to take a look at this little corner right here, which actually I'm going to expand up for you guys, talking about feeding damage and the role that the environment has to play on that. And so while what we see up in this infographic seems a little inverse of what we're actually discussing, we had like a cooler season and all that, but we see, well, flea beetles like to feed in the hot weather. We also have to consider, what is that cool season actually doing to the canola? If you have canola that's actually taking a while to get out of the ground, it's slow to emerge and establish and get to that first true leaf stage, that gives the flea beetles plenty of time to attack it. So that's just something to think about. And then looking at, in reference to the amount of time that it takes for the canola to grow, we have a 30-year average of accumulated growing degree days. I think this is for all of Manitoba averaged, and that's in the gray line. And then we take a look at 2022, and you can see that really that graph doesn't really start until like the first few days of May, actually, compared to all the other seasons. And so we were definitely behind in the growing season for actually a lot of Manitoba. But then, funnily enough, we actually did catch up and actually supersede the 30-year average at the end there. So we did catch up. But when we're looking at the critical periods for that canola to establish, grow, and get set up, and overcome some of those key stresses earlier on, that's where that kind of underneath the 30-year average really matters. Talking a bit about flea beetle insecticide options, we do have a lot available. This is probably not a comprehensive list, but we have quite a bit of seed treatments and foliar insecticides. And I know recently there was some news about a couple lambdicide products that aren't available. So that's something the Canola Council is definitely working towards making sure and communicating with agronomists, retailers, and suppliers to make sure there is supply available to protect your canola, because that is a very important thing for flea beetle management. So just enough about flea beetles for now. Let's just talk about stand establishment. And really this graph is taking a look at the plant counts tool that we have on the Canola Council. And this is grower-submitted, agronomist-submitted data across the prairies, taking a look at plant establishment, emergence, both in the spring and fall. So this was in spring 2021, where we saw, variable amounts of emergence, if we're zooming in on Manitoba there. And then we take a look, there were a few less submissions here in Manitoba. I think there was about 5 or so. But what I really want to focus in on that is that for looking at stand establishment, we always have to take a look at the data from previous years and then set some realistic expectations to set ourselves up for success for the next year. And so while sure we can go and collect a whole bunch of data on that, we need to know what we can do with that. And that should be partially influencing what we're going to be doing for the next year. And so to set your target and evaluate the stand, we're trying to look at an estimate target range of about 5 to 8 plants per square foot. This is some key messaging that is definitely crucial. This is research proven for that. But how do we get there? How do we actually assess that? And one of the ways we can do that, just gonna pop this out, is using one of these little plant stand things. And I've just brought a few along here. So if anyone ever wants to go and actually grab one of these down here, be my guest. We only have a limited supply. And I did bring them in a Walmart bag, but this is not sponsored by Walmart, or you can buy them there. You'll have to come to me or someone else from the Canola Council. Well, those are great tools to have, and it should be definitely included in your agronomist toolbox whenever you're out visiting your fields, either earlier on or maybe if you're taking stubble samples for verticillium post-harvest, bring one of these along, and then you can see what kind of establishment and help dictate your seeding rates for the next year. So just thinking about this stand establishment, some factors you need to consider is what kind of equipment you're running. That may influence, what kind of survivability you'd be seeing, what kind of soil and moisture you're seeding into. Abiotic and biotic pressures, both during that earlier season and later on. If you have a really thin stand, maybe that is more favorable when we're talking about diseases like sclerotinia compared to having a thick stand, which may facilitate more disease. And then, of course, always going to say it again, you have to go back and check your populations because that's going to help dictate what happens next. So, protecting your seedlings, this is kind of that crucial period that we want to be reminded of. It's always about scouting often for that flea beetles, taking a look at your populations, taking a look at anything else that could be causes of yield losses later on. So when we're thinking about, say, that soil crusting issue, maybe that could be caught if you're thinking about looking out for flea beetles or whether you need to spray. Implying your insecticide treatments when necessary, having good evaluations at what kind of action thresholds you're reaching, and then monitoring the weather and soil conditions. So not only is that what's happened before, but also taking a look at the future forecasts. Are you going to be having that big rain that's be able to shoot it up and get out of the ground quickly? Or is it the 2-week forecast fairly dry? You may need to seed that a little bit deeper. So, not too long ago, we actually had a survey with agronomists. I believe it was over 300 agronomists over the prairies. And a couple of the questions that were asked was, in general, what are the agronomic practices that canola farmers are most likely to get wrong? And then what is the one change farmers can adopt to make the biggest improvement in canola yield? And I highlighted essentially all of the ones that happen essentially at seeding. And so we're looking at fertility management, seed rate, plant establishment, seeding depth, soil conditions, seeding rate, dates. All these things play such a major role. And so when we're thinking about providing recommendations to our growers, making decisions with our agronomy teams, it's so crucial to be aware of all these things earlier on, and so you can really set up your field for success. And of course, highlighting in green, hiring qualified agrologists and agronomists. So everyone here is definitely very knowledgeable now after we're hearing all these presentations here today, and will definitely help our growers here in the province. So in terms of just also referring to your agrologists, agronomists, the Canola Council also has plenty of information, and pardon the little mistake, you know, we're not talking about canola diseases here today, but we're talking about a whole bunch of other things on the Canola Encyclopedia, and there's so many resources here, and much more than I could ever condense into a 45 or how many minute long talk I'm having here today. So please take a look at that, and take a look at it before the seeding date starts. You know, make a few mental notes, some things you maybe want to key on for this next growing season. And then the other thing is also taking a look at the Canola Watch. So this is also very timely information. It's not just a huge resource. It's actually tailored to specifically all of you guys in Manitoba and also across the prairies, depending on what issues are actually arising. So we'll be focusing on a little bit more on, say, excess moisture from the last season, talking a little bit more about flea beetle messaging, and that's directly reflective of what kind of conditions we're seeing here. So we're not just giving you a bunch of information, we're giving you guys the information you need. And hopefully I put that QR code a little bit bigger than the last QR code I provided. So if you guys ever want to take a quick snapshot of that, please do so and sign up for that email address or email subscription. And I'm going to probably leave it with that, you know, a little bit time on questions, probably a little shorter than I expected for today, but I really appreciate you guys taking the time out of your day, and also those at home that weren't able to make it from this extraordinary weather conditions we have this week. So thank you.